Movies are back, and so is Ticket Stubs. I did a few of these videos back in 2021, just discussing the movies that I had watched in the past week and giving little reviews on them until I got burned out after attending a film festival. But I am back into movies again. I've been watching some good horror, some bad horror, and some everything in between, and I want to talk about this shit. Let's start with the movie that I was most looking forward to this season, and that is Socks, or Saw X, or Saw 10, or whatever you want to call it. But yes, we have a 10th film in the Saw series, and I couldn't be happier about that. And if your response to that is, dear God, why are there 10 Saw movies? Well, here's a little rundown. The first Saw movie, directed by James Wan and written by Lee Winnell, was released back in 2004. Produced on a very tight budget, it made lots and lots of money at the box office and guaranteed a sequel every year for the next 7 years. While the series would later become the poster child for the sleazy splatter pictures of the 2000s, the first film is actually quite a stripped-down detective story for the most part, revolving around the hunt for a serial killer named Jigsaw, whose MO is kidnapping people who he perceives as unappreciative of life and placing them in contraptions that test their will to live by forcing them to make a drastic decision, often cutting off limbs or mutilating themselves in some horrific way in order to escape. And if you were to ask the average moviegoer about this series, their response typically would be that the first film is rough around the edges, but still a genuinely compelling horror thriller, and that the rest are just meaningless gore porn. But I'm not the average moviegoer. I love them all. Even Spiral to some extent. In my opinion, the Saw franchise reaches its peak at the 6th film. It was at this point that the editor of the previous films, Kevin Groidert, stepped into the director's chair, and oh my god, was that the right decision. He also directed what was meant to be the final installment, Saw 3D, which is not good, but is one of the most entertaining in my opinion. Saw 3D was released in 2010, and it wasn't until 7 years later that Jigsaw was released. Tobin Bell as the titular Jigsaw is the only returning character from the previous films, so it does function as a kind of soft reboot, although the twist does still continue with the absolutely fucked continuity of the series. And then in 2021, we got the 9th film, a spin-off called Spiral from the Book of Saw, starring Chris Rock, which sucks. It has absolutely nothing to do with the other films, but does kinda work as a so bad it's good movie with alcohol and friends. And I only have one of those things. Which finally brings us to 2023 and Saw X. I'm sorry for spending so long talking about the other movies, but it is actually important to explain my thoughts on this movie, and also I just like talking about Saw. Saw X is currently the only film in the series to hold a fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and it's not that Rotten Tomatoes actually matters at all, but I do find it interesting that critics and audiences are really resonating with this one, and I wonder why that could be. Well, 3 words. Kevin fucking Groidert. Yeah, baby, he is back as director for this one, and I cannot tell you what a difference that makes in comparison to the other attempts to reinvigorate this franchise. The timeline fuckery of these movies is the result of Jigsaw's death at the end of the 3rd movie, and the decision to continue the series past this point resulted in some wild justifications for the continued inclusion of Jigsaw. From the 4th movie on, a good 50% of the runtime becomes flashbacks, and the current timeline is justified through a series of reveals that Jigsaw had many accomplices right from the start. Saw X smartly avoids this trap, pun intended, by setting it between the 1st and 2nd movies. This means that not only do we no longer have to hopelessly try to figure out a completely convoluted timeline while watching the film, but that we can actually just focus on Jigsaw, which is, I think, what everyone who likes these movies wants. This one follows John Kramer, an architect dying of a brain tumor who was revealed as the Jigsaw killer at the end of the first film. We pick up with him here as he is informed he has only months left to live, and he spends his days eyeing strangers and dreaming of putting them in jigsaw traps when he sees them do something bad. He then finds out about a doctor who's been forced into hiding by the big drug companies because he's discovered the cure for cancer. John, being the desperate fool he is able to contact the doctor's daughter, who's operating out of Mexico, and she invites him to take part in the treatment. Turns out, It's actually a scam. Yeah, that's right, our brilliant hero, who's always 50,000 steps ahead of his opponents, got Nigerian princed. Unlike the previous installments, Saw X actually is structured like a real movie. It genuinely spends probably a good hour of just setup before we get into the nasty revenge. And it's really compelling setup. It's a really engaging emotional journey for John Kramer to overcome, and if the film had ended at the 1 hour mark, this wouldn't even really be a horror movie, but just a genuinely touching drama? You do have to contend with the paradox that John Kramer is such a genius, but that he's tricked by a pretty shitty scam, to be honest. I actually found it pretty easy to suspend disbelief in that regard, though, considering that this is a man who's in the final months of his life, and I could see that nothing left to lose attitude acting as a sort of blinder to all the red flags that the audience are seeing. And this first act effectively sets up John Kramer for the first time as genuinely just the protagonist of the story, full stop. Yes, he is a psycho, and his methods are, excessive, to say the least, but these are the kind of really shitty people that you want to see in Jigsaw traps. And speaking of the traps, this is the fiercest batch since the 6th movie, in my opinion. There are two major components that make a Saw trap really work for me, and those are tangibility and survivability. What I mean by tangibility is how well you're able to imagine what it would be like to go through that. I think the best example of this in the Saw franchise is the needle trap from Saw 2. It's a very simple premise. Somebody is thrown into a pit of used hypodermic needles, and they have to find a key that's hidden somewhere in there. It is ghastly and horrible, and I just can't watch it. It makes me wince, it makes me want to crawl out of my skin. And the reason it works is that everybody knows what a hypodermic needle feels like, and everyone can imagine what it would be like to dig through a pit of dirty, unsanitary ones. It gives me chills just thinking about it. And survivability is obviously a much clearer term. I just like when someone has a chance of making it out of a Saw trap, and that's something that as the series went on, they cared about less and less, favoring the money shot of gore. Don't get me wrong, I love to see what the trap's actually gonna do if they fail, but it's nice to throw in a couple survivors here and there just to remember that it is possible, and it makes the entire trap scene extremely suspenseful. Are they going to get out of it? Do they have what it takes to survive? And when someone does, you feel this visceral sense of triumph. Believe it or not, these grisly torture machines have the ability to elicit genuine emotion from the audience. And I'm happy to report that nearly every trap in Saw X is both deeply tangible and survivable. And the performances during the gore set pieces are genuinely great. I 100% believe that these people were actually fighting for their lives, and what they are forced to do is just oof. And another thing that makes these traps super effective is that they're quite simple. One of the standouts for me felt like a deliberate homage to the climactic scene of the first film in which Cary Elwes has to cut off his foot. Only here it's taken to an even more intense extreme, and it works incredibly well. I saw this twice in theaters, and the second time I decided to pay particular attention to the audience reactions to the traps. And the reactions that I saw were exactly what I expected. Lots of gleeful cringing and wincing. It really feels like back to basics Saw. There are also many opportunities to get a chuckle or two, especially if you're a longtime fan of the series. So I've established here that Saw X really does tick all of the boxes if you're a fan of the franchise, but even if you're not, I still think a general horror fan could get a lot out of this. Just on a technical level, it's easily the best presented film in the franchise, although that's not saying very much, as the erratic editing and cheap production design is even a joke among the fans. But this is shot and edited like a real movie, and that's a pretty high compliment for a Saw film. Tobin Bell and Shawnee Smith both give genuinely great performances, and the rest of the cast is above average for a Saw film. All in all, there's really not much I can complain about here. The last couple of traps I found a little lackluster, but I had already gotten what I came for by that point, so it wasn't really an issue for me. I also don't think that the twist is one of the best in the franchise. It's not really shocking enough to be genuinely a great twist, and it's not outrageous enough to be a funny twist. All in all, as a bona fide Saw fan, I couldn't be happier about Saw X. Before I give my rating for Saw X, I do want to address that my personal rating system has undergone something of a shift. I used to believe that that there were objective qualities that I simply had to factor into my overall rating, so even if I loved a film, any flaws would maybe bring down my rating a bit, and I just don't do that anymore. I no longer believe that art criticism can be anything other than subjective, and so my subjective rating for Saw X is a 10 out of 10. For me personally, it is the best a 10th Saw movie could have possibly been, and it would just feel wrong for me not to give it my highest score because of that. It's not the same as a Lighthouse 10 or a Mulholland Drive 10 or an All That Jazz 10, but it's a 10 nonetheless. Come on, Kevin, give us Saw 11 right this second. I also saw VHS 85, the 6th installment in the VHS franchise. I actually covered the 4th film, VHS 94, in the first iteration of Ticket Stubs back in 2021. So if you want to know my thoughts on that one, then go check that out. VHS is a series of found footage anthology horror films that typically consist of 4 to 5 segments directed by different filmmakers and usually a framing narrative that wraps around each segment. VHS 1, 2, and Viral were released between 2012 to 2014, and the critical and financial failure of Viral seemed to put a nail in the series' coffin. That is, until the horror streaming service Shudder revived it with VHS 94 in 2021. And since then, we've got an October release of a new VHS film each year, with another one planned for 2024. And to be honest, I kinda love this direction for the series. I tend to treat these films like Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Year anthologies, a tasty little sampler of shorts by some filmmakers that I'm familiar with and some that I'm new to. So while I could probably make the case that the majority of this series' runtime is pretty bad, there's usually at least one segment that stands out from the bunch. So I will always check out these movies, and I always usually have a pretty good time. VHS 85 strays a bit from some of its predecessors in terms of the framing narrative. The previous film, VHS 99, pretty much did away with it altogether, and 85 does a similar thing here. The first films in the franchise would try to explain why we're watching all of these tapes in a way that generally never worked. It would just constantly cut back to the framing narrative and people watching videotapes and going, "That was weird." But in the case of 85, what we get is a fragmented documentary that's been taped over in some places, and this works incredibly well, to the extent that it's actually probably the best part of the film, which I have never said about the framing story in any of the other ones. But unfortunately, that's not a very high bar to clear, because VHS 85 was just not that good. I'm gonna approach reviewing this in the same way I did VHS 94, which essentially is just gonna be me running through each segment and giving my individual opinions, rather than trying to somehow review the film as a whole, despite the fact that it's like 5 different filmmakers putting it together. The framing segment is directed by David Bruckner, who is one of my favorite filmmakers working in the horror genre today. He made the best segment in the first VHS movie, he made The Ritual, The Night House, and the best Hellraiser film. So it's no surprise that his segment is head and shoulders above the rest, although it's still not really quite to the caliber that I would ordinarily expect from him. It's a good old-fashioned tale of scientific hubris that's done well, but doesn't really have anything new to offer in that regard. It does a great job of capturing the atmosphere of analog horror and recreating that style of made-for-TV documentary, but I had just hoped that it would take some surprising direction, especially given that it's stretched out over the course of the entire runtime. But no, it just goes in the direction you're expecting, even though it does it quite well. Overall, it just left me feeling like it was fine, and in any other VHS movie this would be one of the more forgettable segments, but it's the best one here. Next, the first segment proper is not very good. I actually don't even know how to talk about this one, because the only thing that happens is the ending. It's just some straight people going camping, and then they're in a boat and some bad stuff happens, and that sounds like every other horror movie that's ever been made, and again, it doesn't really add any twist on that, except that this segment has a sequel later on in the film. Essentially, they ignore a sign that says "don't go in the water," and then pretty much the whole segment is building up to the answer to why shouldn't they go in the water, and the answer is kind of interesting, I guess. But then the segment ends, and nothing really happens other than some decent gore effects. That's really all I have to say about this segment. Next, the next segment is a slight step up, but again, it just kind of takes a fairly typical premise and doesn't do all that much with it. Essentially, we're watching a news broadcast that I believe is happening in Mexico City when an earthquake happens that causes the building to collapse and kills pretty much everyone except for the cameraman. And then the rest of the segment is a rescue team coming in to try to get the cameraman out, and they encounter some supernatural shit towards the end. And again, that's it. At the very least, this improves on the previous segment by being about something that's a little more interesting and there's actual peril involved before the ending. But again, the problem is that this is a pretty typical premise that doesn't really do anything new and doesn't show us anything all that shocking or interesting. There was a similar segment in VHS 94 which involved a news anchor going into the sewers to investigate a local legend, and by the end she discovers that not only is this legend of a rat monster real, but the rat monster is actually a god that has a whole cult worshipping it and everything, and then the news anchor becomes a vessel for like spreading the rat god's word or whatever on TV, and she throws up on her co-anchor's face and it all melts off in this glorious moment of slapstick gore. It was fucking awesome. It had intrigue and comedy, which then turned into genuine horror, and then just such a wonderful payoff, and this segment has nothing of the sort. From the point at which what's going on is revealed, you could go in any number of directions, but it just ends at the point where things get interesting. By this point in the film, I was just kind of like, is anything gonna happen? And then we get to the third segment. And this segment is also waiting a while for something to happen, but in the lead up it is just really bizarre. Essentially we're watching a performance artist who gives this speech about how technology has replaced God, and then she does a seance to conjure this computer god, and she does this by using a VR setup, which is really confusing because I assume this film is supposed to take place in 1985, given the time codes on the first segment, and also the way this segment and all the others are shot. The beginning of the segment tells us that it's like classified footage or something, so maybe the intention was to show that we've done VR before, but that it has devastating consequences, and to be a cautionary tale for today. I don't know, and I don't really care. But anyway, this seance just takes a really, really long time, and it's a little embarrassing to watch. There's this obnoxiously on-the-nose TED Talk kind of thing she gives before she starts, and it's really poorly written, it's really transparent. And then once she puts on the headset and starts doing the actual seance, there's this like vaporwave music that's clearly trying to make you think what's happening is super cool, but really it's just a woman screaming at a screen saying, "Come on out, God!" And I can't lie, this was the first time in the film that I can genuinely say I was pretty entertained. And also for the first time in this film, the payoff actually felt pretty satisfying. Without spoiling what actually happens, there is a mix of practical effects and digital effects, and the digital ones didn't look very good and were not that interestingly designed, but the practical side of things was fantastic and everything that I come to this franchise for. This segment was directed by Natasha Kermani, who seems to have more of a background in sci-fi than horror, and that really comes across. I think it was a really fun segment, even if I can't exactly call it good overall, because the first, like, 3/4 of it suck so hard. But they suck hard in a way that the first couple segments didn't. They were just boring and uneventful, whereas this one is still uneventful, but certainly not boring. The biggest issue is that it just seems to insist that it's cool while it's actually rather cringy. If it weren't for the ending of this segment, it would easily be the worst of the film, but because of that fun ending and just how weird it was getting to that, it kinda ended up being my favorite. Next! Oh, what a joy, we get to revisit the first segment again. The fourth segment gives us the other side of the story, which makes it really difficult to set up without spoiling the single event that happened in the first segment. But basically it starts out filming a family reunion and does it very, very well. There's a lot of funny, weird characters, and it really captures the atmosphere of that Midwestern family reunion. And we learn that the gathering is a celebration of one of the girls' completion of a rite of passage very specific to this family. So she puts on this tape that they're all gonna watch together in celebration of her sort of becoming an adult, and the first shot is the same lake that the people in the first segment were warned not to go into. And I really like this recontextualization of an earlier segment on a conceptual level. To my memory, this is the only time it's really been done in this series, and I just wish it had been better thought out. The first segment is just extremely uneventful and boring, and then this one is really unsatisfying in the way it wraps up. I also kind of wish that we'd just seen the video that the character shows her family instead of watching the family watch a VHS tape. It's getting a little too meta, folks. I don't know, I guess on the one hand it kind of works because we have the family reunion that feels normal, and then we see it take a turn, and that midpoint realization is a pretty fun, other shoe dropping kind of moment. Perhaps if the first segment was cutting between the people on the boat and the girl filming them, that would have created more tension in the first segment, and then later we can still have that fun twisty moment where she turns on the TV and we say, oh, that was her. I don't know, that's probably how I would have done it, but I'm not a filmmaker, I'm just a soon-to-be published horror writer. I just feel that this two-part story could have been told in a way that was a lot more dramatically satisfying, especially when it comes to how it ends. Ugh, I'm not gonna spoil it, but the ending of this segment is genuinely like my least favorite horror ending possible. Overall, I don't think this segment is like awful, and there was a lot of fun to be had, especially in the first half. It's kind of the polar opposite of the preceding segment, where it has a really good first 3/4 and then kind of drops the ball at the end. Next, and finally, we come to the last segment, directed by Scott Derrickson, whose filmography includes Sinister, Doctor Strange, and the worst Hellraiser movie. And I can definitely say that this segment has the most interesting concept, and it explores it fairly well, actually. I do think it bites off a little bit more than it can chew, and sometimes chooses to focus on the wrong things. But the central concept, which is a detective investigating murders that have been caught on camera before they happen, is exactly the kind of unsettling idea a film called fucking VHS 85 should be exploring. The murder videos have a lot of post-production added, which makes it deeply uncanny and really, honestly, kind of disturbing. Although it does sometimes go overboard on the post-production to the point where the violence is impossible to see. But if you're one of the many people who was deeply creeped out by Sinister's lo-fi pseudo-snuff aesthetic, then I think you would be even more creeped out by the footage here. I think it tries to tackle maybe one too many ideas, and I can pinpoint exactly where I would have said, you know what, I don't think we need that. But this segment has quite grown on me, actually. A lot of the things that I took issue with, I was just too stupid to realize were subtle artistic things that I wasn't picking up on. But I still don't think that there would be any chance of this being the best segment in any of the other films. Except maybe VHS Viral. So that's VHS 85. Quite a disappointing slog, to be honest. I had planned on uploading this video a lot earlier, but it was just such a chore to talk about all 5 of these segments. It really was not a great outing for the franchise, and I hope next year's does a little better. But it's still not the worst horror movie I've seen all year. Oh no, we'll get into that next time. I'm gonna give VHS 85 a 4 out of 10. There's a couple other movies that I've seen recently that I want to talk about, but this video is long enough as it is, so you'll have to wait till the next one to hear my thoughts on When Evil Lurks and Exorcist Believer. Until then, I'll see you next time. I'm Carmela du Maurier, the composer next door, and I'll see you in hell.